Thank you, Bikram, for the introduction. Thanks to the organizers, and thank you to the previous speakers who already touched on a lot of what I want to touch on today, which is having to do with the inability of too much of the discourse in the West to adequately conceptualize the role of violence and the role of colonialism in our modern world. So I want to zero in more specifically on this question of Biden and also the broader imperialist state system support for the destruction of Palestine and why it's happening and how we can explain it. Because superficially, I think it's useful to take seriously the argument, at least, that supporting Israel is somehow chaotic or somehow poor decision by the imperialist system, right? And by take seriously, I don't mean believe it. I mean understand why people arrive at this idea and understand what kind of presuppositions it relies upon in order to embed itself in people's consciousness, right? Because that's where we need to address it. We need to address it in part theoretically, right? Because it's the Biden government looks to be losing to Trump in the coming elections. It's about to cost him the election. There's huge protests all over the European core. I mean, the role of the actual European governments and the world system is coming into sharp relief to their domestic populations and so forth, right? So this is inciting massive crises of legitimacy within the global North states that are actually in a very cruel way converging on this consensus on the destruction of Palestine, most recently with the call for the defunding of UNRWA, right? So fundamentally, right, what is this origin of this idea that Israel is, to use the word from that's often used as an albatross for U.S. imperialism, that it is not useful for imperialism? I mean, and I think it goes along with what the other presenters were generally discussing, is that it basically rests on an erasure of the role of imperialism and colonialism in constituting and reconstituting the world system, right? That even, even if you take some people who are closer probably to our camps, it rests on a notion of capitalism that's fundamentally shorn of violence, right? And when we say shorn of violence, it's also a shorthand for saying shorn of imperialism and colonialism, right? And fundamentally, it's ahistorical. So if we want to understand the role that Israel, above all, and also Israeli action within the world system is playing in support of U.S. imperialism, and why, therefore, it garners such massive support from the transatlantic ruling classes, we need a notion of what capitalism is to begin with, right? And capitalism is, of course, accumulation on a world scale. But it's more than that. It's also a historical process of accumulation on a world scale. At any given moment, it is abstracted from all the processes that are occurring, most of which are necessary for the process of accumulation on a world scale. And it's like a puzzle. It's like, how and why are those processes useful for this relentless accumulation of value? That's what we want to understand, right? And that's what theory gives us, right? And so, if we take the classic works of like Samir Amin, right, that what capitalism is not just accumulation, but it's also polarized accumulation, right? And it's not just that, but it's also about following Marini or Dussel. It's also about maintaining value flows from the south to the north. That is, those value flows, those flows of surplus value, which are claims to labor hours of humanity, pile up in the north and are stolen from the south. And this is exactly why the north is developed, so-called, and the south is underdeveloped. In fact, these are two sides of one historical coin, one historical process, right? So what is the role of Israel therein, right? So from the 1950s onwards, first for France, and then following 1967 for the United States, but also for global imperialism on the whole, its role was to maintain neo-colonial relationships across the third world, right? And it did so by attacking or supporting attacks on Arab republicanism. It supported counterinsurgency in Algeria. It carried out the destruction of the Arab Republican frontline states in 1967. Right. During this period, this was kind of where neocolonialism and anti-colonial developmentalist nationalism were fighting on the battlefield in the Arab region. During this period, there was a fight for the control over the direction of the productive forces in the Arab region. I mean, but since the 70s, right, the Central Arab articulations to world capitalism have basically been oil, finance, and war. Right. This is how the Arab region is essentially articulated within the world system. I mean, there is some forms of production, but of industrial production, there is agricultural production, but this is the core of it. Right. So this is essentially because the U.S.-Israeli goal of the de-development of the Arab region as productive places for people to live decent lives has been advancing since the 1970s and the 1980s, right? So therefore, the role of Israel is not quite the same. It's no longer at war in the same way with regional republicanism, with partial exceptions for Iran and Yemen. Right? Instead, it has a different mandate, right? I mean, the mandate is actually to destroy the working class on two fronts. One, it's to destroy and dominate the Arab working class at the ideological level. That is, to take the words of Ali Qadri, to instill a sense of defeat, right? On the other hand, there's a process of the physical destruction of the working class. That is, you shorten the amount of resources needed for the reproduction of the working class. And this lessens the burden on capital within the region. And you have hundreds of millions of people who are living shorter lives and who not need to be reproduced. And therefore, the value, the resources can be exported to the north by the neocolonial government. Right. And so this is proceeding historically in the Arab region through the whole-scale destruction, not the neocolonial usurpation, but the actual destruction of the resources of the countries as a whole, right? And so this is the sanctions regime in Iraq, and this is the actual escalating into the destruction of Iraq. And then this is the nonstop wars that have been ripping across Lebanon. And this is the U.S. war on Syria and the U.S. war on Libya and the de-development that was imposed upon Yemen and Iraq, who have seen Yemen and Syria, which have seen falls in GDP per capita of around 70% since the onset of the wars on those countries, right? This is this is the agenda of the U.S. This is the agenda that's fully supported by Israel, which has bombed Syria hundreds of times and maintains Lebanon in a state of constant war. And this is also part and parcel of their mission is actually the destruction of the state itself. The state is even a theoretical horizon for Arab anti-sectarian unity, and also the state as a platform for potentially developing the productive forces. That it's gone, the matter has gone far beyond the destruction of Arab republicanism as it's crystallized in state practice and state developmentalism. It's actually advanced to the point of the destruction of the state itself, and then the reconstruction of the state along sectarian grounds and also shrunken grounds so that it's filled by ballooning NGO structures, for example, as has occurred in the so-called Arab Spring in Tunisia, which actually filled with a non-state civil society, which is taking on many state-like tasks, right? So the resistance axis, therefore, and I'm going to conclude with this point, what is the threat posed by the resistance axis to this system, right? Because a lot of people who may have a sympathy with neocolonialism, what is the relationship of this of the resistance axis to a threat to this way of constituting the world system? And actually, I think when we pose it as a series of hypotheticals, it gets very, very obvious, right? In fact, it's so obvious that those of us who are much more sympathetic to the project don't even think about it that much, but it's so clear, right? One, if the US and Israel are trying to destroy Arab sovereignty, the resistance axis is actually trying to maintain state sovereignty and armor state sovereignty in the Arab region. Right? If the US and Israel are trying to destroy Arab democracy, or even the threat of real substantive Arab democracy, these forces are trying to, in fact, in essence, implant some form of potentially Arab democracy, above all in Palestine. Why would the US and Israel accept an Arab democracy in Palestine? right? Most centrally, and I think this is something that we maybe don't remark upon enough, is that the central merit of Israel in the US world system since 1967 has been to impose a sense of defeat, first of all on Palestinians, through Palestine on the broader Arab working classes, and not just in the Arab region, but also through genocidal counterinsurgency throughout the Third World, to impose a sense of defeat on the working class on a world scale, so working class people cannot fight for their interests as a class, right? This is why what is happening is potentially revolutionary, precisely because what is actually happening is the physical, concrete empowerment of populist regional militia who in fact are empowering the working class and who have become a beacon of empowerment, not just for popular classes in the Arab region, but also on a world scale. This is also part and parcel of why forces like Saudi Arabia are so apprehensive about the prospects of military victory by the Palestinians, and do not even really quite dislike Hamas, because these are actually populist working class people's militia that are capable of actually changing the whole orientation, the whole kind of sense of subjugation that the US and Israel and also their neo-colonial allies in the region have successfully imposed for some decades, right? And this is actually turning the tide from one of ideological defeat to an ideological renaissance that can actually threatens to really dissolve this whole sense of powerlessness that I think is one of the central ideological integuments that actually holds together the world system as a whole. So I think these are other things that we have to keep in mind when we look at what's happening in Palestine and when we look at what's happening in the region as a whole. And this is why these neo-colonial and imperialist forces are willing to burn up their domestic political systems of legitimization, their political social compacts, their domestic ideological compacts, because there's something that's fundamentally important at stake. That is, can the working class fight for itself? Can poor people and working people and peasants and slum dwellers organize to defend their interests and succeed in doing so on a world scale or not? And that, I think, is an abstract way of putting what people have been putting very concretely. It's actually the crux of what we're seeing in Palestine, but also Yemen and also Lebanon and also Syria in the world today. So thanks very much. And I'm going to stop there.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on this screen.